Good afternoon, and welcome to the second plenary session of this conference, which is presentation of the keynote papers, which will set the tone and temper of the discussions that will follow throughout the session. This session is being chaired by the conference president, Professor Jeemol Unni. She's Professor Economics and Public Policy, Ahmedabad University. She's already on the dais. The presentations in this session, the presentation on theme 1, the challenge of youth employment, is being made by Dr. Sher Verick. He's Head Employment Strategies Unit in the Employment, Labour Market and Youth Branch in the ILO. Sher, kindly grace the dais. The keynote address on theme 2, changing rural labour markets and rural diversification, is being delivered by Professor Vinoj Abraham. He's Professor at the Centre for Development Studies, Thiruvananthapuram. Professor Vinoj Abraham, please. On the dais, sir, please. Thank you. And the keynote address on theme 3, that is long-term impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the economy and the labour market, is being delivered by Professor Ashwini Deshpande. She's Professor of Economics and Director, Centre for Economic Data and Analysis, Ashoka University. I request Professor Deshpande to please come on the dais. I request Professor Jeemol Unni to please conduct the session.
Good afternoon again. So we begin the most important plenary here, which is the presentation of the keynote papers, which are on the 3 themes that we have chosen for this conference. The first theme is the challenge of youth employment. It was also the theme of the last presidential address by Professor Alak Sharma. This theme note will be delivered by Sher Verick, who is the Head of Employment Strategies Unit in the International Labour Organization in Geneva. He has held many positions, and he has also worked within the ILO, and he has also worked for UN and various other research institutions in Europe and Australia. He holds a master's degree in development economics from the Australian National University and a doctorate in economics from the University of Bonn. He has published, of course, in a range of articles and a range of books as well. May I ask Sher Verick to present his keynote address.
Thank you very much to the host and ISLE, and of course Professor Alak Sharma in particular for the invite. When he contacted me some months back and asked me to come to Itanagar, without hesitation I said yes, but I probably may have thought differently if I realized it was so difficult to get here. But now that I'm here, it's an absolute pleasure to be with all of you and back with old friends and familiar faces to discuss a very important issue. And I'll be talking, obviously, as said, about the challenge of youth employment. Now, this is obviously not a new challenge. It has been discussed for many decades. It's a reality in all labour markets as young people make the transition from school to work. And then, after I was asked to prepare something on this topic, I also thought, well, what can I bring that's going to be different and interesting for this audience? And I decided to have a bit more of a global focus, drawing on a lot of work that we've been doing also at the ILO, particularly during the COVID period. So let me just go straight into it, since we don't have a lot of time. I believe we're trying to finish each presentation within 25 minutes, so I'll do my best to do that. So I'm going to cover in this keynote address 3 areas, looking firstly at the global trends in youth employment, secondly, the impact of the COVID-19 crisis, which has been a topic that we have been working on actively in the ILO in Geneva, and finally, looking at the policy responses. Just for your information, when we look at data from an international perspective, youth are defined as those aged between 15 and 24, and of course that's not a perfect definition, and you can argue in many countries, in many contexts, including here, a broader definition is required, but this is the international definition that is used for most of our data. Secondly, for your information, I would just point out the data I'm using is drawn from ILO's database, ILO-STAT, and that includes modeled estimates, but also national figures which come from the labour force surveys that we compile in a harmonized database. So let me go straight into the global trends. At least we have a screen large enough where I can say, I think you can see the figure. Normally it's the opposite, you can't see anything. Now, this is the trends in the global youth unemployment rates going back to 2008, and in blue is for youth, red is for adults. And as you can see, there's 2 points are marked: 2009, the global financial crisis, and then more recently, the 2020, of course, the COVID-19 crisis. And what you can see here is, of course, as you all know, the difference between youth and adult unemployment rates is very significant. Back in 2009, it reached 8.4 percentage points. But what else I want you to take note from this is that the global youth unemployment rate increased quite significantly over the years following the global financial crisis. I'll come back to that point later. And then you see, of course, the big impact of COVID-19, where the actual disparity between youth and adult unemployment rates increased significantly and reaching 11 points. Again, a point I'll come back to later when I look at the impact of COVID-19 on youth employment in particular. So this has been a reality as long as the ILO has been also generating these modeled estimates in terms of the differences, 3 to 4 times higher we see in most countries as well in terms of the youth unemployment rate vis-a-vis adult unemployment rates, but also that crises hit young people harder. But of course, there's a lot of heterogeneity, and here in this figure, it's looking at the youth unemployment rate, but then by in-country income grouping. So again, for the same time period, but what you can see is it then broken down or disaggregated for the high-income countries in red, middle-income countries in yellow and green, and then blue for the low-income. And of course, low-income countries, the unemployment rate is much lower. Most people cannot afford to be, of course, unemployed. But what I want you to also take note of is that high-income countries, particularly in Europe, did very badly at tackling youth unemployment after the global financial crisis. And there was also a reflection in the persistence of the crisis there, the austerity measures that really hit economies and labour markets hard, particularly in Europe. But they learned a lot more about how to deal with that in recent years prior to COVID, and then COVID hit and things got back on track quite quickly. It's a point that I will return to when we look at the impact of COVID-19. But of course, as we all know, unemployment rate is giving only a very partial and often can be misleading look at what's going on in the labour market. So it's absolutely critical to look at other indicators. Our regional director recently for Africa was asking us in headquarters, give us one indicator that will tell us how youth are doing in the labour market. And we're also, saying it's not possible. You have to look at a set of indicators. And she was insisting on one number. What's the one number that's going to tell me young people are doing well? Well, we stuck with that you need to look at a set, and one of the other key indicators in that set is the NEET rate. So that's the share of young people who are not in employment, education or training. So that includes the unemployed, but also includes those outside the labour force, but who are not in education or training. And that gives you a much bigger picture of labour underutilisation, but also of the gender disparities. And as many of you know, of course, in this region, there are very high NEET rates for young women. And you also see that, for example, in the Arab states on the left, you have, blue for males and red for females. You see much higher rates in most regions in terms of young female NEET rates, but in particular in Africa and Arab states. And Asia Pacific as well, and if you had, of course, South Asia separate, it would be even higher. So the NEET rate is an absolute critical indicator to look at, and is also, for that reason, also one of the SDG indicators. I won't go into explaining where that comes from here for the sake of time, but that's also not the end of the story, just to look at NEET rates. And when countries are looking at what are the priorities, it's also important to look at what's going on throughout the youth population. And here in these donuts, the youth population, using our global estimates, is separated between, I guess that's a mauve color, lilac color, those in employment for young men and young women. So you can see, of course, 41% of young men are globally employed compared with only 28% of young women. We know that. Obviously, this region is even more skewed. But then if you look at the yellow, this is those particularly in education, mostly are captured here, those outside the labour force. but who are not classified in this other NEET. So you have a similar sort of proportion of young women and men. But the real difference here is, of course, as we saw with the NEET rates, the differences is for young women, where the majority of them are in this other NEET, I'm calling, because that's excluding the unemployed. So if you were a government and you were just worried about the unemployment rate, you may look at the unemployment rate, it's very high, but the labour force is actually quite small, so you have a very high rate, but when you look at the proportion of the population, there are other issues. And of course, I wouldn't be doing my job if I wouldn't remind you, of the issues around the quality of employment. It's not just this quantitative distribution, but the nature of employment within that lilac category. And as you all know, I don't need to tell this audience in this country the importance of looking at that issue than formality. I mean, globally, we know that many more young people are in informal jobs. Around 3/4 of young women of young people, compared to prime age adults. There's issues around the access to social protection, employment-related benefits, and of course, also historically, young people have been overrepresented in working poverty. And looking at what's happening in the gig economy, it's also important to understand how that's going to further affect some of these trajectories as young people, in particular, taking up those jobs, as we also heard from Professor Unni in the presidential address. So I'm just setting the scene there in terms of some of the key issues. Let's not just look at unemployment, NEET rates, but also other dimensions, in particular the quality of employment for young people. Now let me come to the impact of the COVID-19 crisis. If you look at our global estimates, and we were releasing these throughout the COVID period in a new publication called the ILO Monitor, which I was also involved in, and there the estimates indicated that youth employment declined by almost 9% in 2020. Globally, it's a massive decline in employment compared to 3.7% for adults aged 25 and above. And it was much more noticeable in middle-income countries in particular, and for young women in particularly those regions. So if you looked at Latin America, there was massive declines of 20% or more for young women, most notably in those countries. And here, I won't go through all of this, but what we can see here is just the trends in the employment to population ratio, set as an index with 100 in the pre-crisis period. 2019, I'm using here as a pre-crisis period. And the world is at the bottom, one on the right. You can see that you've got 4 lines. The green ones are for adults, women and men, and the orange and reddish one is, I'm not very good at defining what colors they are, but it's orange, I think, and red, young women, young men. And you see in general that the young women's decline in 2020, so that V shape is more notable for them compared to young men. But then what's interesting, and that's what we've been working on most recently, is what has happened during recovery. And what we see here is, of course, a sharp recovery in some cases. In high income, you see recovery to the point that the situation in terms of the employment to population ratio has returned to pre-crisis levels and beyond. I'll come back to that point as well. While there's a persistent deficit, in particular in the upper middle income countries, and overall that leaves a deficit, with youth experiencing the greatest deficit in terms of employment to population ratios. I was just looking at some country level data to give a bit more nuance, insights on that, and I just took some figures from ILO Stat. So for India, it's in red, but this only goes up to 2020. Of course, many people in the audience can tell me what has been going on here. But also for Brazil in blue, Republic of Korea, and South Africa. And of course, we have some South African colleagues who can also give you insights on that. But it just shows you at a country level, we're seeing a lot of heterogeneity in terms of youth employment ratios. And we saw, for example, in Brazil, a very big decline, like in most of Latin America, as I mentioned. Decline of around 15% in 2020, but it's quite a sharp recovery, but a persisting deficit. Korea is a high-income country which has put in a lot of stimulus as well. I mean, this has been a unique feature of COVID. The level of stimulus in these countries have been at unprecedented levels. And in fact, now you see a labour market where youth employment population ratios far exceed the pre-crisis level. Of course, India is an interesting story, and I don't want to give too much interpretation. I'm not currently working on what's going on in India. There's a whole of you are. But this issue, and we had, of course, yesterday some discussion about that in terms of the distress employment, why employment actually went up. I mean, just on these figures, you can see a very a bit of a stagnation on the rate or the employment to population ratio for young people. Okay, so that's a few country insights. I won't go into all this detail, so I just want to give you one message here is that, you know, the question is then what happens to people, and particularly young people, when they lose jobs? Typically, as you saw also during the global financial crisis, and we also saw during COVID-19, is that when young people lose jobs or unable to find jobs, of course, as they enter the labor market, unemployment rates go up. They did also during COVID, but what is interesting is actually out of the labor force, the inactivity rate went up much more. So this is just a simple decomposition to show that if you associate the decline in the employment to population ratio, this is in percentage points, so if you take on the left, we saw a decline of almost 3 points globally from 2019 to 2020. Most of that was associated with an increase in inactivity. So actually many people were actually had to exit the labor market because they couldn't search for a job. So this is, I mean, a definitional issue partially in the sense that if you are available for work but not actively seeking, you're classified as being potentially part of the potential labor force, or in particular a discouraged worker. And that makes you into that category which is red. But you see that happening in all regions, but a much greater number of young people went into inactivity in the middle-income countries, particularly the upper middle-income countries. So, you know, there they were, of course, had a lot to do with the COVID restrictions that were put in place. They still prevented people who lost jobs or who were entering the labor market from searching. So that was a key, unique feature of the COVID-19 crisis. There was a big impact on the economy due to the lockdown measures. These lockdown measures also not only affected, businesses which led to job losses, but also prevented the jobless and young people entering the labor market from searching. So this is one of those unique features of COVID. They won't be repeated in a normal economic crisis because that feature of constrained job search is not typically there. And this is why even the situation in India is quite interesting to think about potential added worker effects if women have joined the workforce during the COVID-19 crisis as a result of distress, which we've seen in other crises, the East Asian financial crisis, for example. In this case, we had a lot of constraints based on the lockdown measures, which led to reduction in participation, also if I disaggregated by gender, also for women in other regions. And on the gender part, it's important, of course, to recognize the impact of the unpaid care burden on women, the disproportionate burden, which was, of course, amplified by the closure of schools and care facilities. Okay, I think I'm doing okay for time. Yeah? 5 minutes, good, because I'm coming to the last part, policy responses. And instead of just going straight to the list of things that we normally say you should do, a country should do, I just wanted to reflect a little bit on what have we learned in recent years. I won't have time to perhaps go into all of the things that I've put in the paper and also had planned to speak to, but one of them, I won't go into the details, but there is just want to stress one point here. There is a strong correlation between countries that have better protected labor markets, meaning they try to keep workers in jobs, and what you see then in terms of the adjustment process for young people. So the bottom line is, this is looking at one dimension, which they're called job retention schemes. It's a subsidy that's given to employers to keep people working. It's heavily used in Europe, and not only Europe, but also many middle-income countries are trying this. To some success or otherwise. But you see the countries with very extensive use of these subsidies of keeping people in jobs, and these are not targeting young people specifically, so one can debate what this is capturing. It can be also a proxy for other forms of protection. But then these are the countries where youth employment fell the least from 2019 to 2020. So if you look at countries like France, Switzerland, where I'm based. But given that I don't have a lot of time, let me move to another set of issues that, in terms of where the evidence has been building up on. And these in terms of looking at a package of measures, given the complexities that young people face in the labour market. Obviously, there's no one single solution. There's been a lot of talk in the European Union on youth guarantees. I'm not going to go into that because its relevance in most developing emerging economies is questionable, but I mean, there are some important lessons, and if I had another 5-10 minutes, I could go into that. But on active labour market programs, which are one component within youth guarantees, there's been, of course, a lot of analysis and impact evaluations and meta-analyses on whether they work. And they're including through support of the ILO, with Kluver and others, looking at which programs actually do work. And an interesting finding in that context is that the integrated youth employment programs are more successful in low-income countries, middle-income countries, and high-income, which is a nice result in the sense, well, it's good to apply such approaches there, but they need to be a package of services and initiatives. So not something in isolation, not just a training program in isolation or some job search assistant in isolation. In fact, they need to look at the profiling of beneficiaries, individualized follow-up incentives for the service providers, etc. So this package is critical. I do have a list. We always have lists. We always want countries to do many things, and even yesterday's discussion was touching on some of these. Here, I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, and many of them have also been mentioned in other contexts. I mean, I will just say that the supply side, of course, is not enough. So supply side measures have been, invested in massively across the world. I was speaking with a French development bank, Agence Française de Développement, and key economist there was saying, look, we spent billions of dollars on skills development. We're not seeing any change in outcomes, particularly for young people. The key issue there is, of course, why, whether jobs are being supported through, what we would call pro-employment macro and sectoral policies, and particularly ones that will benefit women and youth. There's, of course, issues around education and training that are still important. I would stress mention the remedial efforts that are needed due to the losses in human capital terms that have happened as a result of COVID. I won't, the rest are also important, but I will just finish on the last bullet point. And ILO is often equally to blame as well. We come up with a shopping list, but what is really important is then to target when needed, but even more important is to learn from implementation. And this is what I think is the weakest in most countries. We are not learning enough from implementation, and that means getting better data and doing more evaluations and feeding that into the policy process. No one gets it right in one go. No one has the full picture. No, policy is going to be perfect, and this is the critical part that is too often missing, especially when it comes to youth employment policies and programs. So thank you very much for your attention, and thanks again, the Chair.
Thank you, Sher, for giving us this very interesting take on what's happening to the youth in different parts of the world before and after the COVID crisis. We go on to the next theme presentation, which is on the changing rural labor markets and rural diversification by Professor Vinoj Abraham, who is the Ministry of Commerce Chair Professor at the Center for Development Studies at Trivandrum. He has been doing very, very interesting research and also coordinates the Commerce Ministry funded National Research Program on Plantation Development at the Center. Yes, Vinoj.
Good morning to all. Thank you very much for this opportunity to be here. Thank you, Professor Jeemol, Unni, Professor Alex Sharma, the organizers of ISLE. It is indeed a pleasure and an honor to be here addressing this August gathering on this issue of rural non-farm sector. The theme is on rural market and rural non-farm sector. I have chosen this particular topic that is written over there, the slow emergence of rural non-farm sector employment in India, shift or diversification. Now, the term non-farm sector, I have used it as non-agricultural sector. It is not any shift from farm to non-farm within the primary sector, but movement from agriculture to non-agriculture sector. That's what I have used it. It is just for the ease of using the particular term, I have used it over there. And the term shift or diversification is used in a sense to give this particular angle, where shift meaning a person or a household leaving the agriculture and moving to a new sector, and diversification meaning a person or the household diversifying into different activities, including agriculture. So agriculture is not left out, but agriculture is part of their activity. Yes, that's the way I understand shift. And that's a question that I also ask here. What is the nature of this change in the rural non-farm sector? Is it a shift or is it a form of diversification that we see? Now, this is the broad outline that I have drawn over here. Some theoretical background, emerging trends and patterns in rural employment, then rural non-farm employment from a time perspective, then kind of classifying households into different types, and then trying to draw certain associations between consumption decile, nature of work, land possession, etc. And then answering some questions relating to rural-urban linkages, and then some concluding remarks as such. Now, quickly taking to the theoretical background, I don't think it requires much description, deliberation here, but just to kind of quickly go through it, the three broad stories are there with regard to rural non-farm sectors emergence as well as the importance of it. One is the mobility story that we are commonly told about, that is the structural transformation and the associated way in which the rural non-farm sector grows. Basically, there are two sides to it, both the demand side and the supply side arguments of the structural transformation story fits in the rural non-farm sector in some way or the other. Now, the demand side argument is essentially that the rising incomes leading to changes in the consumption basket, shifting from food to non-farm demand and goods and services demand rising. Now, rise in agricultural income enhances the demand for goods which are basically urban-centered, but non-tradable services, they start rising in the rural areas, and essentially the rural non-farm sector finds its place in the mobility story through the demand side is through this particular angle, where they rise under non-tradable services in the rural non-farm, non-tradable services as such. In the supply side argument, we have the interlinkages between the rural agriculture sector and the urban industrial sector. Rural non-farm sector are the source of inputs, various inputs, including labor, raw materials, and intermediate goods as such. Now, growth of the urban industrial sector leads to the emergence of the rural non-farm sector, along with the demand for rural agriculture goods and the goods and services that are produced from the rural non-farm sector. Both these two together we can broadly call it as the mobility story, where persons or household, when they move from agriculture to non-agriculture, they are moving into a better income mobility, but that's why I call it as a mobility story as such. There is a second argument which is called agriculture shocks and rural non-farm employment as such. Basically, it's a risk aversion argument. Now, vagaries in agriculture leading to income shocks. In order to avoid such income shocks, livelihood diversification as a consumption smoothing strategy is often used. Now, multiple sources of income act as an insurance against such shocks, and rural non-farm employment is works as an additional source of employment along with agriculture itself. So it's a risk aversion strategy engaging in multiple activities as such. And then we have a third strand, where is agricultural distress and rural non-farm sector employment comes into the picture, where agriculture or the rural non-farm sector becomes an employer of the last resort. Essentially associated with very poor agriculture performance, either in terms of fall in prices or productivity, leading to insufficient income generation from agriculture for households, and movement from agriculture to rural non-agriculture sector, often along with migration as a model of this kind of thing. And this is essentially kind of comes up as a seasonal activity as such. Now, all these three angles together, for the household or for the individual, appears as two particular types of movements. What is the opportunity for mobility, which is basically what I call as shifts, and the opportunity or the movement against risk aversion, that is, you diversify, or you use rural non-farm sector as an employer under duress, which is also a form of diversification that we use. Now, on the basis of this particular background, let me show you some of the trends and patterns with regard to rural employment, and then we'll get into the rural non-farm sector story back again. Now, this story is pretty well known from the 1970s onwards. If you look at this is the industrial distribution of workers based on UPESS category, and from 1977 onwards, 2020-21, there is this consistent decline in the agriculture sector, which has started off somewhere around 80%, right, roughly about 60% right now. On the other, as the agriculture sector declines, the rising sector is essentially the construction sector, which is also pretty well known. But if you look at the manufacturing sector, it has a presence in 1970s, and the share continues to be the same till 2020-21. There is no additional increase in the manufacturing sector. But other services that includes all other services, if you look at, there has been some kind of marginal rise in the other services as well. So essentially, construction sector and other services are the main contributors to this shift in the agriculture sector, in the agricultural employment to non-agricultural employment as such. That's the first thing. And second, also we can note, also the second important feature would be that this big shift that starts off is from the year 99-2000 onwards. If you look at the previous periods before that, yes, there is a marginal fall in agricultural employment, but it is very small compared to the rise in non-farm employment or construction employment that occurs after 99-2000, and the fall is much larger after the period 99-2000 till 2020-21. That's the second aspect that you can note. And the third aspect that you can note is that during the last period between 2017 and 18 and 2021, actually the agricultural employment is not falling. There is actually a small rise, a marginal rise in the agricultural employment among males here. But construction sector employment continues to rise even further. So the construction sector employment continues to rise even further during this particular period, but even when agricultural employment also continues to decline. Now this is with regard to the males. If you look at females also, the trends are more or less the same, just that the share of agriculture there at the starting point was much higher during the 1977, and the fall in agriculture is much lower compared to males during the entire period as such, but the break period seems to be slightly later. From 2004-05 onwards, you can start seeing that the construction employment becoming much more important. Now, in case of females, you can also notice this, that between 17-18 and 2021, agricultural employment does not increase. In fact, it continues to fall, just like the trend, but construction employment further rises. So while all the other sectors, especially rural manufacturing, seems to be kind of stuck at a certain level, and it does not seem to have much changes. Now, the point that I'm trying to is that the main employment source after agriculture seems to be construction, and is very well known as well, but it seems to be increasing in prominence over the period of time as such. Now, if you just decompose this rise in the construction sector employment, the interesting aspect probably to note is that of the change in the employment during the entire period, in the initial years, between 1977 to 87, 87 to 99 and so on, other sectors, other services including, there was some kind of a prominence of sectors other than construction becoming important over a period of time. But what we find is that, especially during the period 2017-18 to 2021, manufacturing sector declines, other sectors decline, even agricultural employment share declines for males. And what we find is the agricultural employment increases. The only other sector that seems to be increasing is the construction sector. A large rise in the construction sector employment when all the other sectors, including manufacturing and other sectors, are declining. That's one of the trends that we see. A very similar trend is visible in case of females also during the 2017-18 to 2021, that there is the entire concentration of employment growth in the construction sector, even when agriculture sector is also falling. So that's one of the aspects, interesting aspects that seems to be happening in the recent past as such. Now, to look further into the type of employment that is arising in the construction sector, we look at the usual principal and subsidiary status, the usual principal status and the usual subsidiary status separately, and then analyze how things have changed during this particular period, 99-2000, the first year that I had told where there was a break point, and 2021. And what we see is, of course, there is a large rise in the construction employment, as what we had said. The share of construction employment had risen sharply from about 5%, less than 5% in terms of the usual principal and subsidiary status, to about roughly about 18% for males, and similarly for females also there was a rise. In case of, if you look at the usual principal status employment, there is, in that case also you do see a rise in construction employment, both for males and females. But the substantial rise in employment in the construction sector is essentially subsidiary status employment. Now, what are the subsidiary status employment? We are essentially claiming that people who are doing some other form of, some other activity, doing construction work as another form of employment itself. So the main activity could be something else, but subsidiary activity could be construction. So that's there seems to be a large rise in that kind of employment in the when we are saying that there is a rise in construction sector, large rise of it also is essentially due to the rise in the subsidiary status employment as well, between 99-2000 and 2021. Now, to understand the kind of change in the rural non-farm employment, what I do now is to drop the idea of males and females separately and try to consider them as households themselves, right? Now, this is the total industrial distribution of, without any classification of males and females over here, and you can see that 76% of total employment in agriculture, and similarly you have construction at 3.3%. Over the years, by 2021, about 60% is in agriculture, and about 15.4% of the workers are in the construction sector. And there seems to be a marginal, kind of a gradual increase in the construction sector employment. All the other sectors, you can see that there was some rise in trade as a sector that was growing till 2017-18, but between 2017-18 and 2021, that has also dropped. Otherwise, all the other sectors seems to be flat over the years as such. There is not much of a rising trend as such. Now, what I do is to understand what is the kind of activities that are done by workers in agriculture sector, those who claim to be agriculture workers, but the kind of works that they do other than agriculture, in terms of understanding what is the mix of activities other than agriculture. I try to understand this by looking at the current daily status. Now, what I do is to kind of identify those workers who claim themselves as working in usual principal status in a particular activity. I measure the current daily status employment of them, and then try to understand how much of the time that is claimed to be in UPSS, that is the major time, is actually spent in terms of current daily status within the particular sector itself. Now, in 99-2000, as you can see, an agriculture worker, 96% of his time was spent in agriculture sector itself. But by 2021, it has declined to about 86%. So there is a fall in the time that is spent within the agriculture sector in terms of CDS, even though he is a worker that belongs to the agriculture sector as a usual principal and subsidiary status. In terms of usual principal and subsidiary status, he belongs to the same sector, but he seems to be moving out of, more time is being spent on other sectors as such. Now, on the other hand, if you look at the construction worker, the construction sector says he is working in the usual principal and subsidiary status. 9% of the time that he spent used to be in agriculture sector in 99-2000, but by 2020-21, 33% of the time that is spent by the construction worker is in agriculture sector. In other words, what we call as the agriculture worker spends much less time in agriculture worker, and what we call as the construction worker spends much less time in construction work itself. So, in other words, there is a much larger mixing of these activities that is going on in terms of who is an agriculture worker, who is a construction worker, at least in these two sectors. In other sectors, this does not seem to be a problem, but at least in agriculture and construction, this seems to be a problem. Now, we could use these dimensions of UPSS and CDS in agriculture and come up with a measure of time itself as to how much is the time that is actually spent in agriculture by an agriculture worker. And if you look at, this is how it looks like. The UPSS worker who claims to be an agriculture worker. The line over there shows the agricultural worker. It is the number of workers or the share of workers. 74% of them were in agriculture sector, and roughly about 70% of the time, 76% of the time of the workers were in agriculture, and 76% of the time was spent in agricultural activities. Now, the line over there which shows the fall in the number of workers, the share of workers as such. So the share of agriculture workers continues to decline, but a larger decline in the share of time that is spent on agriculture work. You can see that as the blue graph over there is agriculture time, and the green one is the non-agricultural time that is increasing. So not only there is a fall in the number of workers, it is also the time that is spent on agriculture that is actually declining among the agriculture workers themselves. So agriculture is becoming more of a mixed kind of an activity rather than an agriculture alone activity. Now, to understand this phenomenon further, what I do is to classify the households into 3 types, into agriculture households, non-agriculture households, and mixed households. Now, what do I mean by agriculture households? A household where all the workers are agriculture workers. All the workers are agriculture workers. It is not one worker, which is the usual definition of an agriculture household, is one worker being an agriculture household. Here I take, if all the workers in the household are agriculture workers, then I consider them as agriculture households. All the workers in non-agriculture household, all the workers are in non-agriculture, then I consider them as non-agriculture workers. And if there is at least one agricultural or one non-agriculture worker, then I consider it as a mixed household. Right? Now, 5 minutes, okay. So I have to pace up things. So if you classify this and then you look at the data, what we see is this, that there is actually, of course, you see the share of agricultural households had dropped dramatically between 2017-18 and 2021, which was 64% in 1999-2000. It has declined to 26%. Pure agricultural households are only 26% in the rural areas now, while what we call as non-agricultural households are 35%. And mixed households consist of around 38%. Mixed households are households where both activities are taken together by individuals themselves. So a substantial rise in the kind of households that we are looking at. Now, if you classify again using the CDS activity among these 3 activities in terms of time dimensions, I'll just summarize what I need to say, and if there are questions later, we can take it up later. In terms of agriculture households, we can see that the mix of activities are increasing. But in terms of non-agricultural activities, the activity seems to be largely non-agricultural itself. There is not much of shift in terms of time that is spent on non-agricultural activities. That seems to be largely non-agricultural itself. And in terms of mixed households, you find that initially there is a presence of agricultural activities, but there seems to be more and more moving towards non-agricultural time that is spent within the mixed households activities themselves. Now, if we classify the households by nature of employment, agriculture households are moving, though the shares of agriculture households are declining, more and more of such households are becoming more and more self-employed. They are moving away from wage employment and moving into self-employment as well. While non-agriculture households, they seems to be moving away from self-employment towards wage employment as such. So there seems to be some kind of a nature of work itself seems to be kind of separating out, where wage employment is getting more focused in the non-agriculture sector, and self-employment seems to be more focused in the agriculture households as well. And mixed household, there seems to be flat. There is no particular trend which says that whether it is increasing or increasing over the years between 2000 and 2021. There seems to have same, but there is a predominance of the self-employed among the mixed households as well. In terms of, if you further classify them into self-employed and on-account workers, we find that overall the share of self-employed on-account workers in the rural areas had been increasing. But this increase, if you look at it, is only in the agriculture households, and you don't see it in the non-agriculture households at all. In terms of unpaid family labor, it seems to be increasing in the agricultural households, while it is declining in the non-agricultural households. So unpaid family labor in general, if you look at the overall trends, we see that there is a fall, but this fall is only in the non-agricultural households, but it is actually rising in the agriculture household. Now what we can see is this, that wage employment is getting separated, self-employment is getting separated, and within self-employment, unpaid labor seems to be rising in the agriculture households. In the non-agricultural households, the paid employment seems to be getting more focused. And the other trend is the regular wage employment is stronger in the non-agricultural households, But if you look at the casual wage employment, which we had said that casualization seems to be disappearing, but that does not seem to be the story once you start disaggregating the data. What is disappearing is agriculture households, casual wage employment, and it is being replaced by unpaid family labor, while non-agricultural households, you have a persistent presence of casual wage labor, which is not falling actually. So what we are seeing is actually the disappearance of the casual wage labor, and it is being replaced by unpaid labor in the agriculture household. That seems to be the story in the, so let me just, now in terms of densities, if you look at this is what it looked like. The three types of households, the agriculture households being the poorest, mixed households next, and the last, and the richest being the non-agriculture households. There is a shift. You see a rise in income. The only point here is that the difference between agriculture and mixed households seems to be reducing between 2000 and 2021, such that the agriculture household and the mixed households, in terms of income distribution, look very similar, while the non-agriculture household seems to be far away from, seems to be having higher income as such. Now, another interesting story is this thing, that it's the nature of land that is being possessed. We don't have data after 2011-12 with regard to land possession, but I use only the data till 2011-12 just to support my argument. I'm using the situational assessment surveys of 2013 and 18-19 just to show that fragmentation of land is occurring, and it is very well known. But the interesting part to look at is this, that of the total land that is held by agricultural, non-agricultural and mixed households, larger share of land seems to be held by non-agricultural households. That is, households who do not do any agriculture work. They seems to be holding much more land than agriculture households who seems to be doing agriculture work. So the share of land that is held by agriculture seems to be increasing. Non-agriculture households seems to be increasing. And this is not just in one particular group as such. If you look at across different size classifications, this is true. Whether you take the smallest classification, you take the largest classification, you see this. The share of land that is held by non-agriculture sector non-agriculture households seems to be increasing, while share of land that is held by agriculture households seems to be decreasing. Among the mixed households, if you look carefully, you would see that there is actually across deciles, across the size classification, there is a change over there, but we'll take it up at a later point. Now, coming to the last point, rural-urban linkages, I'll just go to this thing. What I do is to take up districts across all the districts in India and divide them into agriculture households, find the share of agriculture households in each of these, agriculture, non-agriculture and mixed households, and then classify and take the urban share of population in the district, the manufacturing employment share of population in the manufacturing employment share in the urban workers, and manufacturing employment share in the rural workers. And if you look at the agriculture households, the interesting pattern, you see that there, as expected, as the share of agriculture households are increasing, you find the share of urban population would be negative. Share of rural employment also, share of manufacturing employment in the rural areas also seems to have a negative effect on the rural households. But what seems to have a positive effect is the share of urban employment and the agriculture households. As the share of urban employment in manufacturing sector is rising, there seems to be a larger share of agriculture households in the rural areas. Okay. Now, almost a mirror image or an opposite mirror image is available when you look at the non-agricultural households as such. As the share of non-agriculture households seems to be increasing, it is the rural share in the manufacturing sector that seems to be driving the non-agriculture households, but not so the urban share in the agriculture sector. Now, the point that I'm trying to drive is that the interlinkages between the rural agriculture sector and the urban manufacturing sector, that does not seem to be very strong. What seems to be quite strong is that for a shift from agriculture to rural, if the focus is on rural non-farm sector as such, probably the answer is not at looking at urban manufacturing itself, but looking at the rural manufacturing itself. And urban manufacturing does not seem to be driving the non-agriculture sector households as such. With regard to mixed households, we do not see any particular trend as such. I will leave it over there. Let me go directly to the conclusions. There are some interesting arguments. If you look at the manufacturing sectors that are growing up in the agriculture sector, in the rural sector, these are the major sectors, apart from the big sectors of textiles and other sectors. If you look at where the share of food production, manufacturing of food products, manufacture of food products, wood, non-metallic mineral products, and manufacture of furniture. These are the big things that are growing in these sectors. But if you look at, these are actually sectors that are actually having certain conflicts with the agriculture sector itself. Agro-based sectors, some food production, of course, is agro-based and it is agro-complementary also. But wood and wood products, it is forestry-based and it is not the traditional agro-complementary. It is actually competing for resources with the agriculture sector. Similarly, you will find if you're manufacturing of other metal and mineral products, it is actually competing with the other natural resource-based industry, and it is competing with the resources in the for the agriculture sector. Similarly for furnitures as such. Now, the point that let me come to the conclusions that I was trying to make over here. The slow emergence of the rural non-farm sector is visible, and the construction employment as an alternative employment and a source of multiple employment is rising. The rising time share of non-agricultural work in agricultural employment is also visible. And we can see that there is a period of shift that is between 1977 to 1999-2000, and a period of diversification between 1999-2000, especially the period after 2017-18 to 2021 as such. Now, pure agriculture households are reducing, non-agriculture households are increasing, and in the recent years, mixed households are rising. The income distribution and land distribution with non-agriculture households seems to be improving. Agriculture households and mixed income households are increasingly looking similar in terms of income distribution. And rural non-farm sector is associated with rural industrialization, while agriculture seems to be associated with urban industrialization. Now, the question is which way to go. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vinoj, for that very interesting thought about the difference between shift and diversification within economic activities in rural India. Next, we have the third theme, keynote, long-term impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the economy and the labor market, by Professor Ashwini Deshpande, who is a professor of economics at Ashoka University and the founding director of the Center for Economic Data and Analysis at Ashoka University. It's a very interesting site you should go to and take a look for the amount of data that they put up there. She has shifted her work from international debt to, and is most known for her work on economics of discrimination and affirmative action with focus on caste and gender in India. She has won a series of prizes, the Axim Award for Outstanding Dissertation in '94, 2007 V.K.R.V. Rao Award for Indian Economists Under 45, and the Scoch Award for Gender Economics in 2022.
I also actually want to take a minute to remember Dr. Ajit Ghosh, who actually should have been here. Foremost scholar of unemployment, who I first encountered through his writings in Economic and Political Weekly. Eventually, he became a close friend. And when he went into surgery, I said to him that, okay, see you at Itanagar. And so we had plans of hanging out and joking as we always did. And it's a real loss for all of us that he's not here with us today. So, but his legacy lives on, and I think we should, the best tribute to Ajit would be to honor him by continuing to focus on employment issues that so animated his entire life and intellectual pursuits. With those words, let me jump straight into my presentation. We are now 3 years on since the pandemic started, and we have a much clearer picture of how the pandemic disrupted economies around the world. In India too, economic lives of households, individuals have seen a marked shift during this period in all dimensions, from how much they earn to what jobs they do to how they save. What began as a health emergency soon rendered millions of people, especially those from poorer households, without jobs and by consequence without income, struggling to secure the basic needs of life. If you read the economic survey, that's the latest economic survey, it would appear that what I said on the previous slide is really history, that we've actually emerged on the other side of the pandemic and that economic distress is really behind us. So when quoting one of the passages from the economic survey. It says, India's economic and social indicators are not only on the path to firm recovery, they've actually surpassed pre-pandemic levels. The survey claims that labor markets have recovered beyond pre-COVID levels in both urban and rural areas, as observed in supply side and demand side employment data. And this assessment is based on several claims that labor force participation rate of women has increased, unemployment has declined, and I apologize for the typo in the printed version. By mistake, I typed employment as and not unemployment, but the survey says unemployment has declined. Maybe it was a Freudian slip. There's been greater formalization of labor. Employment in organized manufacturing, especially large establishments, has increased. Demand for NREGA work has declined, suggesting reduced need for safety nets on account of a revival in employment in rural areas. So these are all the reasons that the economic survey gives for us to believe that the period of economic distress is really behind us. Fortunately, we can look at these claims with data. So let's see how true these claims are. I'm not going to have time to give you all the data, but I want to tell you that the center that I lead at Ashoka, SIDA, I welcome you to visit the website of SIDA because we have been commenting regularly on the economic consequences of the pandemic as it unfolded. So there's a wealth of data and data narratives on our website, so please visit that. And individual researchers at Ashoka have also been contributing regularly to the analysis of the effect of the pandemic on people's lives. The data that we report on is the periodic labor force survey data, which is annual, and the CMI's Consumer Pyramids Household Survey data, which is a panel data collected every 4 months. So together, both these data sets give us a fairly good picture of what's happening to the economy. Bottom line, to cut a long story short, there are several reasons for us to believe that the long shadow of COVID on the economy is actually not over. So let's look at overall employment and income briefly. If you believe CMI CPHS numbers, then around in April 2020, the first lockdown, about 113 million people lost jobs compared to the previous month, March 2020. Mohan and Kaur have written also for SIDA using the PLFS data to estimate the decline in employment due to the first lockdown, and their estimates are actually 107.3 million, which is interesting given that PLFS and CMI, CPHS have very different methodologies, very different survey, the sample, but the estimates are not that far off from each other. And, which makes you believe that these numbers are in the ballpark, they're probably correct. Rural incomes, again, this is CMI data, declined by 19% in the first month of lockdowns. Urban incomes were 41% decline. Now, I've looked at specifically at women's work, what happened to women's work as a result of the first lockdown. In absolute terms in India, unlike in the developed countries, more men lost employment than women, but this reflects pre-existing gaps in labor market participation and in employment. So if you look at proportionately, which is conditional on being employed pre-pandemic, women lost more in August 2020 relative to men. The other dimension of women's work is work in the domestic sphere, which is called reproductive labor or domestic chores. And India, along with Pakistan, has amongst the most unequal divisions of hours spent on domestic work between men and women. Depending on the activity, women can spend as much as 10 times more time on domestic chores than men. And this gap actually narrowed in the first month of the lockdown, if you again look at CMI data. But time spent on leisure fell sharply both for men and women. Now, if this had lasted, then we would have something positive to talk about. So my work with Naila Kabir, we find that over and above all the conventional factors, it's the burden of what is called reproductive labor by feminist economists, which is the combination of domestic chores, cooking, cleaning, washing clothes, gathering fuel, gathering water, house maintenance, whole range of tasks, taking care of children, taking care of the elderly. All of these tasks are a major constraint on women being able to access paid employment, assuming paid employment exists. So the fact that it doesn't exist is another story, but assuming that it exists, this is a major constraint on women not being able to access paid employment. Now, if the decline in the time spent on domestic chores in April 2020, if that gap had lasted or had even further become smaller, it would have been a massive silver lining to the dark cloud of the pandemic. And in fact, LinkedIn had brought out a report which said that men have really stepped up. As you remember from WhatsApp, men were posing with their jhadus, while the maids were not coming, saying, oh, we are doing so much housework. So if this had actually persisted, this would have been a massive silver lining. Unfortunately, that was not to be. In fact, already by December 2020, the gap had actually gone back, not only gone back, but exceeded the pre-pandemic level. So the gap between male and female time spent on domestic work has worsened, which means that the constraint on women being able to access paid work has actually now worse compared to the pre-pandemic period. During the pandemic, we know the story. Agriculture ended up being the sector of last refuge. Migrants' long march, you see that also in the tables that Vinoj showed, how the share of agriculture didn't really fall between 1920 and 2021. The recent increase in female labor force participation, about which I believe we'll hear in the evening, is basically what it reflects is an increase in the proportion of women in unpaid agricultural work. So it's not really women's employment that's gone up. Basically, again, agriculture has been the sector of last refuge. Overall, in the last 2 decades, in line with structural transformation, the share of agriculture in total employment has been declining. In any case, distress-driven return to agriculture is not a long-term solution to the employment problem in India. So, in CEDA, we try to look at also the longer picture, just the last 5 years, what's been happening. And if you look at the last 5 years, according to CMI data, then the real story, the real action is in the purple line, which is manufacturing. And so you see the sector that's supposed to take up the slack that agriculture releases, the labor force that agriculture releases, that's the one that's actually shown a decline in over the last 5 years. So I don't know why the numbers are not showing up. So together, these 3 sectors, if you just focus on mines, manufacturing, and real estate, these 3 sectors accounted for 30% of all employment in 2016-17, and this declined to 21% in 2020 to 21. Manufacturing, which contributed 17% of GDP, has seen a sharp decline in employment of almost to the tune of 46%. And if you look at today's GDP data that's been released, you see that the slowdown is actually coming really from manufacturing. So there's cause for worry on that front as well. The economic survey gives data from the annual survey of industries, which is registered, workers in registered factory sector, and it shows an increase, and that's correct. We have the ASI data also on the CEDA website. It does show an increase, but it's an absolute number. In the same time, working age population is also increased. So labor force is also increased. So as proportionate terms, it's not at all clear that there has been an improvement in terms of workers in registered factories. Now, CPHS data, because it's every 4 months, you can actually track changes in employment very, very frequently. And you see that dip, the first dip, which was the first lockdown, and you see a lot of volatility in employment. So every period, the story is a little bit different. And we are still not, in the aggregate, we are still not back to the pre-pandemic levels. Real estate and construction is more or less back, but manufacturing is the real cause of worry. And, now we learn that manufacturing rate of growth itself has slowed down, forget about its employment consequences. So what I want to end by saying is that the Indian labor market, already before the pandemic hit, had pre-existing deep-rooted inequalities between rural and urban workers, between male and female workers, between different caste groups, between tribals, etc. So there are lots of schisms that already existed in the labor market. In addition, We have been battling a problem for the last 15 years posed by jobless growth, where growth was high initially, but did not lead to commensurate increase in employment. The last few years, even growth has come under a scanner. And on top of all that, in the last 5 years, there have been 3 major shocks to the economy: demonetization, the haphazard implementation of the GST, and the COVID-19 pandemic, which, given that India's labor market is largely informal, and already hit by all of these problems, is really not good news at all for the future. And it's going to take several years, if not corrected, for these problems to remain. So I'll just end by saying that employment generation, particularly rural non-farm employment, about which we heard in the previous presentation, it needs to be a central pillar of economic policy in the future if we are interested in the long shadow of COVID, sort of going away. And again, to come back to what I started with, that would, by putting our intellectual energies into developing these policies, we would be paying the most fitting tribute to our friend Ajit Ghosh. Thank you.